We are a team made up of practitioners from Slalom, Philadelphia, focusing on how to implement a corporate carbon tax at Slalom. As the world intensifies its focus on climate change, individuals and organizations alike must take ownership in driving towards solutions. We've seen a plethora of solutions and messaging for combating climate change that focus on how individuals can reduce their carbon emissions, but this approach alone cannot fully mitigate the worst impacts of climate change. We took a look at the reported greenhouse gas emissions of a few of our local clients at Slalom Philly and compared them to the emissions from the average American household. It is clear to see that corporations must act. Although many of the world's largest companies have already set climate goals, fewer of them have actually actioned these goals in a scientifically consistent way. Implementing corporate carbon taxes aligns profit maximization with climate outcomes. By factoring in climate externalities as cost of business, organizations will be driven to reduce their footprint and the associated cost, in the same way they're incentivized to drive down traditional business costs. Why a carbon tax? A carbon tax is the government set price paid for each ton of greenhouse gas emissions emitted. There are a couple different methods that would factor greenhouse gas emissions into the cost of doing business, but the internal carbon tax is the only one that does not depend on governments or other organizations to take action. A carbon tax allows companies to decide the dollar value of their emissions. Using an internal carbon tax not only helps align profit motives with environmental outcomes, it also lays the groundwork for measuring carbon footprints, driving better data-driven decision-making and risk mitigation. The first step to implementing a corporate carbon tax is to measure the company's greenhouse gas emissions, which alone is no small feat. Greenhouse gas emissions are categorized as scope 1, 2, or 3. These range from direct to indirect emissions and have been clearly defined by organizations like the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. We built an MVP of a corporate carbon tax system we could implement in Slalom Philly by calculating Philly's carbon footprint and highlighting the impact this would have on our P&L. We want to acknowledge that this solution so far is just the baby steps to getting a carbon tax off the ground. In the midterm, we would love to keep working with this idea to understand how we could implement a carbon tax slalom-wide. In the long term, we would like to build this out into an offering we can provide to our clients to help them accelerate their own climate-related goals. Using Proceed's AdCar framework, the goal of this MVP is to raise awareness of our carbon footprint and understand how the cost of our emissions would impact P&L. We're currently in the awareness phase of socializing the case for change across the organization. We hope in the future to be able to move through the desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement sections to eventually establish and monitor both KPIs and OKRs to hold ourselves accountable to our goals, and to factor emissions considerations into decisions both at the SLT level and below, like evaluating projects. To estimate our 2019 carbon footprint at the MVP level, we use the Greenhouse Gas Estimator tool provided by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. This calculator provides a framework for the calculations, as well as the science-based emissions factors for how to convert our inputs into CO2 outputs. We identify that the primary source of emissions at Slalom are purchased energy, transportation, and goods and services. Our building in Philadelphia purchases 100% renewable energy, so even though we consumed 53,000 kilowatt hours of energy in 2019, our emissions from that energy were actually zero. To estimate our emissions from transportation, including commuting daily to the office, we sent out a survey to our office asking them for their primary mode of commuting and how many miles they commute to the Slalom Philly office. We then extrapolated this mix and mileage across our headcount and made the assumption that every person would commute the distance from their home to Slalom Philly every day. These assumptions can definitely be tweaked in the future, but they provided us a reasonable place to start out. For goods and services, we worked with our office manager to estimate the cost of purchased goods across all categories in 2019 and use the provided dollar to greenhouse gas emissions factors to get to the CO2 equivalent. In Slalom Philly overall, we calculated that our annual carbon footprint is 272 tons of CO2 equivalent, although we expect that this is underestimated due to not being able to factor in emissions from working from home or the potential for longer distance client commutes yet. With our CO2 annual carbon footprint, we multiplied it by an effective carbon tax rate of $50 per ton of CO2 to find that, had we assessed a carbon tax in 2019, it would have been $13,600. Choosing a carbon tax rate is not yet a science. McKinsey released a report showing the disparity of carbon tax rates in use across different corporations. We chose $50 per ton for this MVP based on the minimum recommendation by the Environmental Defense Fund. We would expect to consistently update this carbon tax rate in the future if we actually implemented a carbon tax to follow the available science and be a leader in the space. For Slalom Philly, this carbon tax accounts for less than 1/20th of 1% of our annual revenue, and that is actually only $91 per employee annually. We've calculated that this tax could be paid fully with a very minimal average bill rate increase of only 5 cents. Our immediate next steps focus around refining the carbon tax model to improve the accuracy of our calculator and emissions factors, as well as assess other offices to understand how the tax level may vary across different offices in different geographies and energy markets. The longer-term path towards implementing a carbon tax across Slalom must involve three key decision points: when and how a formal tax would be implemented, how to price the carbon tax, and how to invest in the revenue generated by the tax. The key towards a successful carbon tax implementation is buy-in from leaders across Slalom at all levels and an understanding of why a carbon tax is so important. Slalom has built huge climate momentum over the past year. Let's capitalize on this and take the next step on our journey.